Listen up, because history is full of people we've been told were monsters, villains, absolute scum of the earth. But when you actually dig into the facts, strip away the propaganda, and look at who was writing the story, something wild happens. A lot of these so-called villains weren't evil at all. In many cases, they were the good guys, the ones fighting for freedom, justice, or simply trying to survive against empires that wanted them erased. Today I'm counting down the 10 most famous villains in history who were actually the heroes of their story. And by the end of this video, you're gonna see how the winners write the history books, and how often the real bad guys were the ones holding the pen. Let's dive in, starting with number 10. At number 10, we have the Luddites. Yeah, the guys you probably learned were just angry idiots smashing machines because they hated progress. That's the story that's been repeated for 200 years. But here's what actually happened. In the early 1800s, skilled textile workers in England were watching their entire way of life get destroyed overnight. Factory owners were bringing in new machines that could do the work of dozens of craftsmen. But these machines produced cheap, low-quality goods, and the owners used them as an excuse to slash wages, hire untrained women and children for pennies, and force people to work 16-hour days in dangerous conditions. The Luddites weren't against technology. They were highly skilled artisans who had spent years mastering their craft. They were against being replaced, starved, and treated like disposable parts in a machine. So they organized, they wrote letters, they petitioned Parliament, and when none of that worked, they broke into factories at night and smashed the machines that were smashing their lives. The government response: they sent 12,000 troops, more than Wellington had fighting Napoleon at the time, made frame, breaking a capital offense, and hanged, deported, or imprisoned hundreds of Luddites. Meanwhile, the factory owners got richer. The word, Luddite, became a slur for anyone afraid of progress. But these people weren't afraid of progress. They were fighting for fair wages, safe working conditions, and the right to not have their entire profession wiped out without warning. Sound familiar? The Luddites were basically the original labor rights activists, centuries before unions existed. They lost the battle, but they were absolutely on the right side of history. Moving to number 9, we have Nikola Tesla, the man portrayed as a mad scientist who talked to pigeons and wanted to weaponize earthquakes. That image didn't come out of nowhere. It came directly from Thomas Edison and his paid newspaper cronies. Edison was pushing direct current, DC electricity. Tesla, working with Westinghouse, proved that alternating current, AC, was safer, cheaper, and could travel hundreds of miles without losing power. Edison's response: a smear campaign. He paid schoolchildren to capture dogs and cats, then publicly electrocuted them with AC current to prove it was deadly. He even helped invent the electric chair using AC just to associate Tesla's system with death. Newspapers called Tesla insane, dangerous, a dreamer who would never amount to anything. Meanwhile, Tesla was inventing wireless communication, remote control, neon lighting, and the foundations of radar, decades before anyone else. He was offered millions for his patents and turned them down because he wanted humanity to have free energy. Edison became the beloved American icon. Tesla died broke in a hotel room, feeding pigeons. But today, every single power grid on Earth runs on AC. Tesla was right. Edison's propaganda machine just made sure we forgot that for a century. At number 8, we have Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk who supposedly hypnotized the Russian royal family, slept with half the aristocracy, and single-handedly brought down the Romanov dynasty. That's the story. Here's what actually happened. Rasputin was a peasant healer who gained the trust of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra because he was literally the only person who could stop their hemophiliac son Alexei from bleeding to death. Modern historians believe Rasputin may have been using early forms of hypnosis and possibly aspirin, which was new and would have helped clotting issues. But whatever he was doing, it worked. The Russian nobility hated him. Why? Because Rasputin, a dirty peasant with no education, had more influence over the Tsar than they did, and he kept giving the Tsar advice they didn't like: stop the war, make peace with Germany, give land to the peasants. Advice that, honestly, might have saved the monarchy. So the nobles spread rumors. Rasputin was a devil worshipper. He was having orgies in the palace. He was controlling the Tsarina sexually. Almost none of it was true. The famous stories of him surviving poison, bullets, and drowning, exaggerated or completely made up by the people who murdered him. Rasputin became the perfect scapegoat. When the revolution came, the Bolsheviks pointed at him and said, "See, the monarchy was corrupt." The nobles pointed at him and said, "See, This peasant destroyed Russia. Meanwhile, the real problems were a world war, starvation, and a disconnected aristocracy. Rasputin wasn't a saint. He drank, he womanized, but he wasn't the demonic puppet, master of legend. He was a convenient villain for everyone who needed someone to blame. At number 7, we have the pirates of Nassau. The Golden Age pirates we've all been taught were bloodthirsty criminals who terrorized the seas for no reason, except many of them were actually refugees from one of the most brutal labor systems in history. In the early 1700s, merchant and navy sailors faced horrific conditions. They were paid almost nothing, flogged for minor offenses, given rotten food, and pressed into service against their will. Desertion was punishable by death. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended, hundreds of thousands of sailors were suddenly unemployed with no safety net. Many turned to piracy. But here's what's wild. Pirate ships were often more democratic than most countries at the time. Captains were elected. Loot was shared relatively equally. Injured pirates got compensation. Black, white, and indigenous sailors often served as equals, something unthinkable on land. They even had early forms of workers' compensation and universal healthcare funded by the crew. Nassau became a pirate republic where crews voted on decisions, something that didn't exist in England or France. The British called them criminals, but many were former sailors who refused to starve or be beaten to death by naval officers. They created floating societies that were, in many ways, freer and fairer than the empires hunting them. They weren't heroes to everyone. They attacked ships, took hostages, and killed when necessary. But the idea that they were uniquely evil compared to the legal navies that routinely impressed, flogged, and executed their own men, that's propaganda written by the people who needed piracy to seem monstrous to justify hunting them down. At number 6, we have Chevalier Dion, one of the most fascinating figures in history, who was dismissed as a freak, a liar, or a scandal when alive, but was actually centuries ahead of their time. Dion was a French diplomat, spy, and soldier in the 1700s who lived the first half of their life presenting as male and the second half as female. For decades, European high society literally bet on what Dion's true gender was. The London Stock Exchange had active betting markets on it. But here's the thing, Dion wasn't deceiving anyone. They served Louis XV as a male dragoon captain and spy, then openly lived as a woman for the last 33 years of their life, with the French government officially recognizing them as female. After death, the doctors who examined the body found both male and female characteristics, what we would today recognize as intersex traits. Dion wasn't confused or crazy. They were a brilliant diplomat who helped prevent wars, exposed corruption, and lived authentically at a time when doing so could mean death. The villain label came from people who couldn't handle someone who didn't fit neatly into their boxes. Dion's story was mocked for centuries, but today, we recognize them as one of the earliest openly transgender figures in European history, someone who lived bravely and authentically when the world offered no language or acceptance for it. At number 5, we have Joan of Arc, the teenage girl burned at the stake as a witch and heretic, only to be declared innocent 25 years later and made a saint 500 years after that. The ultimate historical redemption arc. Joan was a peasant girl who, at 17, convinced the French army to let her lead troops against the English during the 100 Years' War. She won battles. She turned the tide of the war. She got the Dauphin crowned king. And for that, the English captured her, put her through a rigid trial, and burned her alive. Her crimes: wearing men's clothing's armor, claiming to hear divine voices, and embarrassing the English by beating them on the battlefield. The trial transcripts still exist. They're painful to read. Grown men trying to trap an illiterate teenager with theological word games. But 25 years later, when the French retook the territory, they reopened her case. Every charge was thrown out. She was declared innocent, and in 1920, the Catholic Church made her a saint. Joan wasn't a witch. She wasn't crazy. She was a teenage girl who heard a call, answered it, and changed history. The people who killed her weren't defending God. They were defending their political power. And history eventually saw through the lie. At number 4, we have Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in ancient Britain. Rome called her a barbarian, a savage who destroyed cities at a blind rage. The truth is 1,000 times darker. When Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, died, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman Empire, hoping to protect his family. Rome responded by annexing the kingdom, flogging Boudica publicly, and raping her teenage daughters. Boudica's response wasn't madness. It was justice. She united the British tribes and led a rebellion that sacked 3 Roman cities, including Londinium z modern London. For a brief moment, Rome lost control of Britain entirely. Rome eventually crushed the rebellion. Boudica poisoned herself rather than be captured, and Roman historians wrote her story as a cautionary tale about barbaric women who get too much power. But Boudica wasn't a villain. She was a mother avenging her violated children and a queen defending her people against colonial oppression. Rome called her savage because she dared to fight back against an empire that saw her people as less than human. At number 3, we have Toussaint Louverture, the man who led the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave uprising in history. Napoleon called him a monster. French plantation owners called him the devil. But Toussaint was the closest thing the 18th century had to a real-life superhero. In 1791, enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, rose up against their French masters. Toussaint, a former slave who had earned his freedom, joined the rebellion and quickly became its greatest leader. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a brilliant strategist, diplomat, and statesman. Under Toussaint's leadership, the rebels defeated the local French forces, then the Spanish, then a British invasion force of 60,000 men. He abolished slavery, wrote a constitution, and turned Haiti into a functioning state that traded with Britain and the United States. Napoleon, furious at losing France's most profitable colony, sent an army to crush the rebellion and restore slavery. They tricked Toussaint into negotiations, arrested him, and shipped him to a prison in France, where he died of cold and starvation. But Haiti declared independence anyway, and Toussaint became the father of the first black republic in the world, a nation born from the ashes of slavery. France spent centuries portraying Toussaint as a bloodthirsty tyrant, but he was the man who proved that freedom was worth any price, and that enslaved people could defeat the mightiest empires when they fought for their liberty. At number 2, we have Spartacus, the gladiator who led 70,000 slaves in a rebellion against Rome. For 2,000 years, Rome told us he was a dangerous criminal who threatened civilization. The truth is almost the complete opposite. Spartacus was a Thracian soldier captured and sold into slavery. Trained as a gladiator, he led a breakout from a training school in Capua with just 77 men, using kitchen utensils as weapons. From there, his army grew to nearly 100,000 as slaves, poor farmers, and oppressed people flocked to his banner. For 2 years, Spartacus defeated Roman legion after Roman legion. He wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for freedom. His goal was to lead his people north, out of Italy, to their homelands where they could live free. Rome responded with panic. They sent 8 legions, their best generals, and eventually Crassus and Pompey, to crush the rebellion. Spartacus was killed in battle. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way. As a warning, Rome wrote the history. Spartacus became a cautionary tale about what happens when slaves get ideas above their station. But for 2,000 years, every oppressed person dreaming of freedom has looked to Spartacus as proof that rebellion is possible, that chains can be broken, that even the mightiest empire can tremble before people who refuse to stay enslaved. And at number 1, the most famous villain, who was actually the hero of his story, William Wallace. Thanks to Braveheart, most people think of Wallace as Mel Gibson screaming, "Freedom," in blue face paint. But the real story is even more incredible, and the English propaganda against him was relentless. In the late 1290s, England under Edward I invaded Scotland, claiming the throne. Scottish nobles were divided, many submitted. Wallace, a minor knight with no great lander title, refused. He began a guerrilla campaign against the English occupation. He killed an English sheriff who murdered his wife. He raided English garrisons. He united common Scots who were sick of foreign rule. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and Andrew Moray led a vastly outnumbered Scottish army to one of the greatest victories in Scottish history, completely destroying an English army through superior tactics. For a brief moment, Scotland was free. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, but the English came back stronger. At Falkirk, Wallace was defeated. He spent years on the run, possibly traveling to France and Rome seeking support for Scottish independence. Eventually betrayed, Wallace was captured, taken to London, and subjected to one of the most brutal executions in history. He was hanged, drawn and quartered, his body parts displayed across Britain as a warning. The English chroniclers called him a bandit, a murderer, a traitor. But within a generation, Scotland rose again under Robert the Bruce, inspired by Wallace's resistance, and 700 years later, Scotland still remembers William Wallace as the man who refused to bow, who showed that one person with courage can inspire a nation to fight for its freedom. The English crown needed Wallace to be a villain to justify their conquest. But history knows the truth. He was a patriot, a hero, the man who lit the flame of Scottish independence that still burns today. So there you have it. 10 of history's greatest villains, who were actually the good guys. From William Wallace to the Luddites, these people were sneered, demonized, and written out of history by the people who had the most to lose from their stories being told truthfully. The next time someone tells you history is just facts, remember this list. Remember that every empire needs its villains. And sometimes, the greatest villains are just the people who dared to stand up to power. If this video made you rethink everything you thought you knew about history, drop a comment with the one that shocked you the most. And if you want to see more videos exposing the lies we've all been taught, hit that subscribe button, because the truth isn't always what they told you in school. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.